Hello everyone, thanks for coming again. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce everyone here today to Alex Murray of Queen's University Belfast. And Alex is Professor of Modern Literature at Queen's, and he's also founding co-editor of CUSP, Late 19th, Early 20th Century Cultures, published by Johns Hopkins University Press. Alex's most recent books include Decadent Conservatism, Aesthetics, Politics in the Past, with Oxford University Press, published in 2023. And with Kate Hext, he has edited the Oxford Handbook of Oscar Wilde, which was published in 2025. As a contributor to that volume as well, I can also add that Alex, as an editor, has the most saintly patience imaginable. And I'll say no more. Thank you, Alex. Alex is now currently editing Conservatism and Literary Studies for Cambridge University Press, and he's working on his next monograph, Creativity and Critique, English Literary History at the Fin de Siècle. I just want to add too, these are just some of Alex's publications. His work is tremendous, and he really produces voluminous, brilliant scholarship. So we're really looking forward to this paper today. Terra Australis beckons at the slip rails of the imagination, Wilde, settler colonialism, and cultural renewal.
So thank you to Deaglán and to Joe for the invitation and the generosity with the hospitality. It's been wonderful, and thank you to Eric as well for his wonderful organization. It's been such a pleasure. So the 20th century afterlives of Oscar Wilde are various. So authors, artists, activists, and actors have appropriated his life and works for any number of ends. The majority of the scholarship focuses, I think we could say, on Wilde as a figure of resistance. So Wilde as someone who inspires anti-colonial movements or who inspires cultures of sexual dissidence. But there is, I think, another Wilde out there that I'm going to look at today, and that's the way in which Wilde's might be thought of as inspiring or contributing to a settler colonial aestheticism in the early years of the 20th century. So settler colonialism is broadly understood as a land-based form of domination which seeks to eliminate but also reinscribe indigenous populations and their traditions, and in which culture plays a central role. So for Patrick Wolfe, often credited with being the first to theorize it, settler colonialism is a complex social formation marked by continuity through time and must be approached as a structure rather than as an event. So part of that structure is literary. And Jason Rudy has offered a compelling examination of settler colonial poetics, arguing that colonial poets were attempting to create their own imaginary homelands. As he explains, this work of remaking took important literary and specifically poetic form, sometimes parodic, sometimes imitative, but most often knowingly asserting connections between home and abroad, or between an original home and a new homeland to come. Yet studies of settler colonial poetics have been quick to suggest that aestheticism is incompatible with that culture. So Elika Boma argues that the circulation of poetics within the British Empire at the fin de siècle is marked by the Jingo poem, which, she says, was predicated on the worlding both of British society and its national literature, in precisely the opposite way to how the ateliated decadent poetry was a poetry of interiors and introversion, of little magazines rather than popular newspapers, of night, not day, of a little England shrunk down to the dimensions of a drawing room. So I find this a deeply reductive and problematic characterization of what aestheticism is doing and the way in which aestheticism and decadence contributes to settler colonial poetics. So Oscar Wilde in the early years of the 20th century inspired colonial writers with a language of cultural renewal. Drawing on Wilde, they were aware that the Victorian literary forms and values that had shaped their colonial cultures must be overcome and replaced by autonomous aestheticism that could articulate new futures. And some of these writers were drawn to nation-building projects. Others saw themselves as aloof and individualistic, but all saw Wilde as offering a model for a new critical art in a settler colonial context. So I'm going to introduce 3 case studies here, all of which will revolve around a little magazine. The first focuses on the north of Ireland, the first and last colony, of course, and the Uranian aesthete Forrest Reid's fraught relationship with the Ulster Literary Theatre and their little magazine, Ulla. The second takes us to India and the single issue of the neo-aestheticist periodical Pegasus, which harnessed Wilde in its campaign for cultural renewal in Calcutta. The final case study moves to Australia and examines The Heart of the Rose, a short-lived Melbourne-based little magazine published between 1907 and 1908, with a focus on their most Wildean contributor, a man called Lewis Essen. So, in 1884, an 8-year-old boy sitting in the window of the Linden Hall Library spotted a man of remarkable appearance. That man was Oscar Wilde, and the young boy's name was Forrest Reid. The chance sighting of the great decadent writer strolling around Donghaile Square was a momentous moment in the young boy's life. Reid's fascination with Wilde never really came to an end. So by 1903, Reid had produced his own handwritten version of Wilde's poetry and prose. So I found this in the Berg Library. And his interest in Wilde and Wilde's inspiration for him kept going really up until about 1910, 1912. He published his first 2 novels, distinctly Wildean and aestheticist. So there's A Kingdom of Twilight, which is his first novel with its epigraphs by Dowson and Verlaine. And this was a novel that he sent to Henry James, and Henry James wrote some nice words. And so Reid took the audacious step of dedicating his next volume to Henry James. This did not go very well because this was a explicitly homophile publication. And Henry James was freaked out and wrote to him and said, "Please never contact me ever again." So that was, I think it's also interesting that it's published by David Nutt, and the Nutt Company, of course, published Wilde's fairy tales. So there's an interesting sort of overlap there. I want to focus now, though, on his complex relationship with a little magazine called Ulla. Ulla was the organ of the Ulster Literary Theatre and the brief flowering of an aestheticist's Ulster revival. It ran to 4 issues from November 1904 to September 1905 and was founded as the Ulster counterpoint to the Irish Literary Theatre, which was established by, of course, Yeats, Lady Gregory and Edward Martin in 1899. The editors promoted a northern exceptionalism, repeatedly claiming that Ulster does things differently and so needed its own literary revival. The key point of difference was that where the Irish literary theatre was mystical and symbolist, Ulster art had to be satirical. Revivalist art, whether north or south, was hardly welcoming to Wildean aestheticism in many ways, too insistent on political commitments, too trapped by the past, too tied to nationalism and regionalism. In this context, it was unsurprising that Reid struggled to find any common cause. So it's a striking visual publication, as well as having some very interesting content. So Reid's first publication in the first volume featured a review of the Hugh Lane Gallery at the Royal Hibernian Academy in Dublin, and Reid argued that Ireland was in desperate need of a permanent modern art gallery to enhance the spiritual life of its people. While the art exhibited here was not first-rate, Reid praised sketches by Whistler and paintings by Charles Shannon and William Rothenstein. The essay concluded, "This morning, when I left the house, it was to step into a world Whistler had painted. And as I stood there still for a few moments and watched the pale, strange light in the sky, more than ever before I realized how a great painter may become part of one's life, a part of one's world, and how much one is indebted for the beauty of the world to those who have seen the living spirit of beauty face to face." So art offered Reid, in an eminently Paterian fashion, the greatest crystallization of experience, and that heightened, intense experience made his world all the richer. So if Reid's article had been a statement of aestheticism, the next issue of Ulla saw him developing his own poetic transformation. His short story, Pan's Pupil, revolves around a young boy's reverie on the riverbanks in which he has a vision of the god Pan. So the scene seemingly takes place in Beaver Park Forest on the banks of the River Lagan in South Belfast. The god talks to the young man, who expresses surprise that his interlocutor is aged, convinced that eternal youth is a given for all gods. Pan tells him that he feels the snows of old age in his blood, and that night will follow quickly once his conversation with the young boy is over. The boy pledges himself to Pan, but as the god continues to reflect on his own mortality, it is far from lovely for one who has lived so long. The boy asks if Pan has not heard of a gentle god who came into the world to put an end to suffering and sorrow. This god who has come from the east, who was destroyed by his disciples and whose priests tore down Pan's altars. Yet for all the appeal of Jesus Christ, Pan reminds the young boy that I am today the spirit of the earth, and I am worshipped in the beauty of each passing hour. So Reid's attempt at transforming Ulster into an Arcadian fantasy was not a transformation that the ideologically invested editors of Ulla seemed to appreciate. In his second volume of memoirs, Reid reflected on the challenges that he faced from the magazine's editors. There were so many Irish gods, and Pan was not one of them. There were so many little boys who spoke the Ulster dialect, and mine was not one of them. As Reid concluded, it was not due to obstinacy. It was merely that I did not see how writing could ever be anything but the expression of an individuality, while Reynolds, the editor, I gathered, thought it should be the expression of the policy and aspiration of a group. So Reid's commitment to beauty and to individualism would see him cut a lonely figure in the cultural life of his home city. He lived through a tumultuous period in the life of Belfast, but remained stubbornly aloof to all the political travails of the signing of the Ulster Covenants, the Great War, the partition of Ireland, and the establishment of Northern Ireland. Yet we should also be wary here, though, to not accept that Reid's was the only mode of being inspired by Wilde in Northern Ireland. As my colleague Tom Hume has demonstrated in his book that just came out last month on queer life in Belfast, that Wilde's work was used as a means for providing queer community and connectivity in the city from the 1890s through to the 1960s. So the sectarian north of Ireland was, in 1905, perhaps not an auspicious place to launch a new Wilde-inspired mode of aesthetic idealism. But the war years focused minds, and in Calcutta, a group of writers and artists would set out a new vision for settler colonial culture. So Pegasus, a quarterly journal devoted to art, literature, and the theatre, was edited by these two men, Cyril Elgood and Richmond Temple. Was published by Thacker, Spink & Co., one of the premier publishers in India in this period. So only 100 volumes of issue 1 were ever published, and library holdings are rare. There's only 2 that I know of. One is at University College, Oxford. Do you find Richmond Temple's holding lobsters interesting? It's a good look. So some of you might know who Richmond Temple is. So Richmond Temple was associated with queer circles in London. He was the director of publicity for the Savoy Hotel from 1922 to 1938. He was a friend of Robbie Ross, Siegfried Sassoon, Arnold Bennett, Vivian Holland, Frank Schuster, and Osbert Sitwell. And Temple and Holland took a tour of Copenhagen, Helsinki, and Arctic Finland in 1937, and the small volume of travel writing was produced, which the Clark holds. I think it's the only holding of that. So Cyril Elgood attended Oxford before being commissioned into the British Army and was posted to India in 1914. He returned to England in 1919 and trained at St. Bart's before he became the physician to the British legation at Tehran in 1925. He thereafter became an expert in the history of Persian medicine and is most well known for this book on a medical history of Persia and the Eastern Caliphate, which came out in 1951. So as the preface to the first issue makes clear, theirs was an endeavour unlikely to find much success. Such a quarterly as we have tried to make Pegasus, besides being unusual for India, would, in a small way, we have hoped, fill a want that is felt by exiles from the atmosphere and associations of Europe. It was indeed out of the ordinary. While there was a number of little magazines published in the war periods in India, most famously Indian Ink and the Indian Review, these were generally supportive of the war and included contributions from both Anglo-Indian and Indian writers, including Rabindranath Tagore in Indian Ink and Sarojini Naidu in Indian Review. But Pegasus pursued a very different direction, as you can see from the table of contents. So this is very much a queer aestheticist publication. Most striking here is the publication of two Wildean apocrypha, those poems in prose adapted from his after-dinner stories. The two that appear here, Simon of Cyrene and the Actress, were told to Amy Lowther when she was a child, and which she allegedly wrote down soon after, only to publish them along with two other stories in 1912 in The Mask. The note accompanying these tales claims they were given permission to reproduce them by Ernest Marriott, who was the assistant editor of The Mask. So the issue also features Temple's review of Stuart Mason's bibliography of Oscar Wilde's, which had been published the previous year. And Temple here praises Robbie Ross and declares that Ross's essays aside, Mason's work is the best ever published on Wilde, and claims one is taken back to live in those wonderful and strange days. So Wilde also offered inspiration when it came to the periodicals engagements. So that's the Wilde prose poems. So Wilde also offers inspiration when it comes to the periodicals engagement with the war in Elgood's essay on Culture Kampf, which examines the failure of the German attempt to impose culture through violent conquest. Elgood argues that the only connection between culture and war was the figure of the poet as iconoclast. The poet's heart and his imagination fix upon love and war. There is a sympathy between his mind and his subject, for a poet is ever a warrior. He stands against the world, attacked by false critics, mocked at by Philistines. He is forever holding aloft the standard of beauty and good taste. His weapons are the keenest ever forged, and his cause the most righteous. The image of the poet as a righteous warrior, whose only cause is beauty, echoes, of course, Wilde's idea of the antinomian artist who has no concern with normative values of the Philistine. So an essay by Alan Ackland Pittman on walking through Père Lachaise Cemetery recounts coming across Jacob Epstein's recently erected tomb for Oscar Wilde. Pittman notes that even in his death, controversy pursues him, before lamenting, "Oh, the tragic loading of the great man's fate." Yet Pittman suggests that Wilde has found in Père Lachaise a spiritual home. I think Chopin was satisfied when men pardoned Oscar Wilde and built his splendid sepulchre. So Pittman's sense that Wilde's new funereal monument constitutes something like a pardon is of a piece with the periodical's embrace of Wilde as a figure who can, at this time of turmoil, offer a new vision for the future. So in addition to Wilde, there's also homage paid to Simeon Solomon, one of the great aesthete artists, and in his own way as much of a queer martyr as Wilde. So the reproduction of 3 of Solomon's early prints from the 1860s are accompanied by a note from Temple, which opens with great sympathy. For poor Solomon, there was no place in life. Casting reality aside, he stepped back into the riotous pages of Petronius. Perhaps on the Paris boulevards, he might have existed. In respectable London, that was impossible. So while queer aestheticism is the dominant mode of the periodical, there are several pieces which engage directly with the Indian context in which the periodical was written and published, and suggest the editors had a sort of colonial chauvinist undertone to their writing. So Elgood penned a rhapsodic evocation of India's natural wonders, in which he draws on the language of the sublime to convey the overwhelming excess he experienced as he traversed the nation. And it's a very, very strange statement here. I'm not going to read it out, so I don't have time, because man seems here to be European and accustomed to the impoverishments of home, cannot appreciate the grandeur that's so foreign to him. But of course, there's no place in Elgood's vision or understanding for the vast indigenous populations of India who are invisible in Pegasus. So Richmond Temple's essay on Calcutta theatre, subtitled Criticism as Creative Force, offers a program for cultural renewal that is seemingly more open to the non-European. Temple laments the quality of the commercial theatre in the city, but celebrates the Parsi players who had recently performed at Beaton Street. most likely at the Minerva Theatre, praising the determined attempts that this brave and now highly successful band of players are at bringing their productions up to the highest standards of Oriental dramatic art. To raise the standards of theatre in Calcutta, it was necessary to embrace criticism as creative practice. Throughout the ages, without any exception, the death or sterility of criticism has meant the cessation of vitality in intellect and the death of worth. Criticism is, as we suppose, is now generally conceded, one of the creative and constructive arts. But criticism must be utterly fearless. It must be entirely independent. So this is very much a Wildean vision of criticism as a force for cultural renewal. Sadly, Pegasus seemed to only ever have one issue. In the first volume, they tell us that their next volume will feature essays on Beardsley's influence and one by Ernest Marriott on the future of the theatre. But I cannot ascertain if a second volume or any other subsequent volumes ever appeared. Pegasus is very, very hard to find and very, very hard to track down. So my third and final example is from Australia. There were plans that never progressed terribly far for Wilde to undertake a tour of Australia. In January 1883, Wilde told reporters in New York that his next destination would be Australia, but he never made it. Yet Wilde's plays were popular in Sydney and Melbourne, and as Richard Fotheringham has demonstrated, were being performed and his name circulated freely in the press during the trials and the period in which he was in prison. And of course, Australia features in a number of Wilde's social comedies as an object of ridicule. I take these very personally indeed. Wilde was also not very enamoured of Australian poetry. He wrote a rather nasty review of Australian poetry in which he predicts that one day Australia might produce great poetry, but not just yet. But it was only a few years after this review that Australian poetry really came into its own. So this was largely around the National School or the Bulletin School of Poetry and the bush poets, Henry Lawson and Banjo Patterson, who were forging a distinctive Australian poetics in the 1890s. And this was a poetry that didn't have much space really for decadence or aestheticism, arguably. But at the same time, we have the emergence of Australian symbolism in the figure of Christopher Brennan, who was Australia's great symbolist poet and published his obscure mystical verse and a series of extraordinary essays on Stefan Mallarmé in the Bulletin. So you've got this nationalist publication, which is publishing some of the best criticism being written in English on Mallarmé in the 1890s and the early years of the 20th century. So Brennan was involved in just about every avant-garde endeavour in Australia from 1895 up until the outbreak of the First World War. He became a fervent patriot and rabidly anti-German. His wife was German and they were having a divorce at the time, which possibly explains that sentiment. But in 1907 and 1908, he published in this little magazine called The Heart of the Rose, which was published in 4 editions from 1907 to 1908. And they were limited to print runs of 500. And as you can see, they all have their own title and they all take on their own individuality. And I'll focus here very briefly on the first issue. This is the contents page, and I guess its mode is very much symbolist. As you can see, there's translations of Verlaine. In other issues, there's going to be translations of Rimbaud. There's essays here on Baudelaire. There's essays in subsequent issues on Swinburne's verse dramas. So it's very much trying to tap into a symbolist aesthetic. But it also features a wonderful dialogue by this man called Lewis Esson. So Lewis Esson was born in Edinburgh and migrated with his family to Melbourne at the age of 4. He studied briefly at the University of Melbourne before he left to Europe, and while in Ireland he met Synge and was encouraged to develop an Australian literary theatre along the lines that had been so successful in Dublin. He returned to Australia and became the founding member of the Victorian Socialist Party and began to be estranged from the circle around the Bulletin that he'd previously been linked with. So in 1915, he was rejected from war service on health grounds, and he moved to New York and then to London. In London, he meets Yeats, and Yeats again encourages him to set up an Australian national dramatic movement. And he returns to Australia and sets up the Pioneer Players in 1922, producing a series of original Australian plays before collapsing in 1926. But my focus here is on Essens' earlier work. So his first contribution to The Heart of the Rose, Terra Australis, is a wonderful dialogue on the potential of Australian art, clearly modelled on the decay of lie and the critic as artist. The short dialogue features three figures, the host, the mystic, and the stranger. It opens with a discussion on the past. For the stranger, Australia is a country without history or culture. Australia has been born too late in the world's history ever to become a beautiful country. All beauty, says Carducci, dwells in the past. Australia has no past. This was not an uncommon sentiment or lament at the time, particularly of travellers to Australia, but the host takes the idea that Australia was culturally barren as being far from reality. He says it's stuffed with worn-out things, novels, plays, pictures, cast-off fashions. The Prometheus of the Australian imagination is fettered by the mountain of British fact. The stranger cannot understand how a country with no past can envisage a future. But the host explains that this cultural terra nullius offers a potentiality foreclosed to Europe. In the old worlds, the mind has grown languid with the burden of beauty bequeathed by the past. Australia is not a country, it is a symbol. Terra Australis becomes for the host not a geographical entity, but a state of mind, the vital force of creativity and vision. She is everywhere, in America, India, Italy, ancient Persia, in modern Ireland too. Terra Australis beckons at the slip rails of the imagination, promising but to the rebels a fresh perception of beauty, an unblazed track to truth. Terra Australis is a synonym here for the unfettered imagination, found at all times, and in particular in the aesthetes and radicals of the fin de siècle. The host offers a catalogue of great Australians. Rodin, Ibsen, Maeterlinck, Walt Whitman, Verlaine, and Whistler are all Australian. So yet this aestheticist overcoming a British fact, like the socialism Essens supported, struggled in the stagnant swamp of settler colonial culture. Essens' 1912 satire of Australian politics, The Time Is Not Yet Ripe, is a drawing room farce that draws clear influence from Wilde's social comedies. And it tells the story of Doris Quiverton, who is the daughter of the Liberal Prime Minister of Australia, and she's engaged to marry, much against her father's wishes, Sidney Barrett, who's a revolutionary socialist. It's a truly bizarre play, and in a bizarre turn of events, both Doris and Sidney are standing in federal election for the same seats, and much of the play follows their rival electioneering campaigns. The drawing room scenes are replete with the elegant comedy of manners, bon mots, and paradoxes, and confusions of Wilde's most successful dramas. Doris, in particular, has a wit of Wilde's dramatic heroines. When her father fulminates that Barrett is a socialist, a revolutionary socialist, Doris responds, he has a big sheep station in the Riverina, and goodness knows how many sheep. I love sheep. Sir Joseph is unmoved by her sheepish affections, noting that Barrett proposes to confiscate land and capital. As radical as all that sounds, Doris is keen to point out there are limits, and that Barrett has no intention of confiscating his own property. Sidney may be a socialist and an advanced atheist, but he is not a philanthropist. Yet when Sir Joseph meets Barrett, he discovers it's worse than your ordinary run-of-the-mill socialist. He's a socialist very much in a Wildean vein. Barrett, fired up by 4 years at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, has returned to his native land appalled by what he finds. The country is stagnant, decadent, and the young Australian with his bright, fresh mind, untrammeled by the traditions of the past, that is the current phrase, repeats all popular superstitions from beer to bishops of his fog-bound ancestors. Australia is an outer suburb of Brixton. So Barrett's socialism is very much not of economics but of ideas, and his views have very clear echoes of Wilde's A Soul of Man under socialism. On the campaign trail, he tries to convince people to vote for him, and let's just say it doesn't go particularly well. Because he says that what Australia needs badly is immigration, not workers, but Egyptologists and biblical critics, metaphysicians and Italian tenors, and it needs them very, very badly. But when pushed, he offers a vision with clear echoes of Wilde's radical individualist aestheticist socialism. This is his stump speech. Well then, I believe in compulsory Greek in schools and universities. I believe in open-air cafes where one could drink wine and meet one's friends and listen to string quartets. I believe in picnics and festivals, a 2 hours working day, and the abolition of all useless machinery. I believe $1 million a year should be expended on art, and I favour the suppression of daily newspapers, picture shows, A&A debates, feminine fiction, pony racing, pleasant Sunday afternoons, and all other forms of popular amusement. Does that touch the heart of the people? It does not touch the heart of the people, and no one votes for him. But Essen's aestheticist vision of socialism has two functions. The first is satirical, a desire to undermine the piety of socialism and to highlight the disingenuousness of political campaigns in which no politician except Barrett actually would make the error of telling the truth. And the second is to make a serious case, as Wilde does for socialism offering the only radical reorientation of economic and social structures that could foster a transformative individualism. So, to conclude briefly, the three case studies I've offered here are radically different, but in each we can see a Wilde that becomes the impetus for cultural renewal. Of course, this should come as little surprise to us. Wilde's work is capacious, flexible, and contradictory enough that readers in the early years of the 20th century took from it what they most desired to see. Just as Wilde was liberal, radical, and conservative, a cosmopolitan and a nationalist, an innovator and a traditionalist, so were those he inspired. Settler colonial Wilde is simply one of many afterlives, and none of those should dominate our understanding of his influence. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Alex. It's prompting in me all sorts of thoughts about the ways in which the materials that you're covering here, I mean, one of the things that was prompting me to think about was Australia's relationship culturally to the process of historical processes. And the one thing that immediately came to mind, but it's both tangential to what you've been talking about, but also maybe in some ways constitutive to Australian literary history, is Voss. Mm-hmm. And, you know, when we think about trying to understand, outside an Australian context, reading a novel such as Patrick White's great magnum opus, that novel, which I haven't read for 30 years, but my memory of it is that it is an encounter, a literary encounter with an Australia with indigenous histories that had never been engaged with and which are not here. Yeah. Right. Does that seem right?
That's exactly right, Joe, that this vision of Australia in these little magazines makes no reference whatsoever to Indigenous cultures. They just don't seem to be there. And I think that's part of what the settler colonial poetics is doing, is it's focusing on European and European culture.
It just makes me wonder, I mean, White was a queer writer, and whether, I simply have no idea whether he was at all interested in the legacies of aestheticism. I just really don't know.
He was influenced in some ways by Brennan, and through Brennan back to queer aestheticism, but certainly the way in which symbolist poetics develops in Australia means that, there's a long history of symbolist writing, and I think that's very much seen in someone like White. It goes right through to contemporary writing as well, that symbolism is the dominant mode, but it's often not particularly queer in Australian context. That's quite unusual.
That's interesting. Yeah. Are there comments or observations or questions colleagues have? Were you able to look at the correspondence that Wilde had? He had, I think, some letters of recommendation to go to Australia.
I didn't manage to pull those up in my time, but I think, yes, it would be interesting to see if they were just rather generic letters of recommendation, or whether there was anything particular about Australia in them and about how Wilde might have been welcomed in Australia. But they were part of the Japan tour as well.
Yes, there's a cache of, downstairs, there's a cache of letters which are letters of recommendation from Americans who are in contact with an American poet who became very important in Tokyo, and that's Lafcadio Hearn, to whom there are 2 museums in Tokyo. Okay. And that, I think the idea was maybe that he was to travel to Australia first, and presumably Melbourne would have been the key destination, given the fact that it was a very developed, an important and significant cultural hub, and then to Tokyo. But he would hardly have been the first aesthete, to travel across Japan, given Christopher Dresser, the designer, spent such a lot of time there in the 1880s. Yvonne.
Two questions. How big is this project? Is the scope of it? Yeah. So did you do a survey of multiple different colonies and find out where this kind of settler colonialism seems to be practiced and narrow it down to these magazines, or do you have the sense that there's actually a lot of other magazines that you could potentially be writing about?
I think that is the question, is whether this is a much broader project or whether this is simply looking at 3 case studies. So the way in which this came about was I was in University College archive, and Elizabeth Adams said, "Oh, we've got this thing that I've never seen before and no one's ever seen," which was Pegasus. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. So I had a look at Pegasus, and then it just sparked off in me a thought about the Heart of the Rose, and then I also thought about Ulla, and I thought about little magazines in colonial contexts. And I mean, Australia, there's a few other ones, so the Heart of the Rose is certainly not the only one. In India, I don't know if there are any other aestheticist magazines. There's lots of other sort of national progressive magazines, but I'm not sure if there are too many other aestheticist ones. And on the island of Ireland, I mean, obviously you've got the ones associated with the Irish Literary Theatre, but I wouldn't call them particularly aestheticist. But there aren't too many Irish little magazines that I think you would describe as being aestheticist.
The other question is my own ignorance. I presume we have this image up. Can you talk us through this image a little bit?
Yes, so this is Sidney Long's 1914 painting, The Spirit of the Plains. So Sidney Long was a great Australian symbolist artist. So Australian symbolist painting is amazing and wonderful and really unknown. So if anyone's interested, there's a great book by Denise Momocci on symbolist art in Australia, which you'll see some amazing, wonderful symbolist art, much better than anything being produced in England at this point in time, and really a kind of lost history for the afterlives of symbolism in the early years of the 20th century.
Thank you very much. Can I just say something about acknowledging the incredibly important work Elizabeth Adams has been doing? It's really important. We have wonderful librarians at the Clark, and it's great to, the librarians here at the Clark really care for the collections. Elizabeth has this marvelous collection, the Robert Ross Archive at University College London, and she is really extraordinary, the way in which she just gives things to one. She said, "Oh, I think you'll be interested in this. It's marvelous." I was thinking a little bit about New Zealand, a completely different country, but not so very far away, but with a very different settler colonial history. It's always intrigued me that Catherine Mansfield was obsessed with Oscar Wilde as a young woman, just completely obsessed, and wanted to dress like him, which he kind of did. It's really quite fascinating. I mean, that went on in high school. Other comments? Kristen.
I'm trying to formulate this into a question, and I haven't had enough caffeine yet. But I'm thinking about the kind of like settler colonial aestheticism that you're describing as almost a kind of counter to modes of aestheticist or decadence, like imagining of places abroad, right? That there's a way in which it seems like some of these figures could be sort of trying to articulate something about their own authority and situatedness within these places abroad that are being imagined by poets and painters in London or in Paris or whatever. Do Did you detect anything of that in the way that, especially I'm thinking about the magazine that you were talking about from India and the one from Australia, because it seems like part of what you're talking about is that in order to establish their authority, there also needs to be the sort of erasure of the actual populations of, like you were talking about, that the magazine was kind of erasing much of the culture of Calcutta, and then Joe's question about the kind of erasure of Aboriginal history. Do you feel like that? Do you get a sense of? I guess the question I'm asking is about the extent to which you feel like these settler colonial aesthetes are kind of positioning themselves as having a kind of degree of expertise about and authority over these spaces that they're trying to transmit, or do they seem similarly kind of mystified or frustrated by a kind of inability to comprehend the cultures that they're coming into contact with, that I was trying to think through yesterday? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I don't think you mean those indigenous cultures.
Yes.
Yes.
Or, yes, and kind of like their sense of how to kind of navigate or have a response to cultural production in the spaces that they're occupying.
I mean, I think it really is, certainly in the case of Australia, but also in the case of Pegasus, that it is this sense that the culture that exists the European culture needs to be overcome. That is the main focus. And I think that's what's sort of interesting about it is, in some ways, that culture also includes Wilde. It includes Wilde social comedies, because they're being produced in Australia and in Calcutta and in Bombay and Mumbai. I mean, they're being produced from 1906 onwards. So part of the culture these writers are responding to is Wilde. I find that interesting, that he's part of this sort of this colonial cultural infrastructure, but they're also using his ideas to overcome that culture as well. So I think but there's no sense that these writers are reflecting on the indigenous cultures. There's a landscape that they struggle to comprehend and struggle to articulate. So I think Brennan's really interesting because he never writes about Australia. There's no koala bears, there's no gum trees, there's no landscapes at all. These are sort of mystical landscapes of the imagination, that there's a refusal of the physical place in which he is. And that's quite common, I think, for symbolism in Australia. What you then get, but I guess that's also in some ways a response to the bush poets and to this focus on the Australian landscape and on the pioneers who are working that landscape, and they want to refuse that because they see that as being part of a kind of jingoistic nationalism. So there's a sort of complex relationship between jingoism and then symbolist aestheticism, which wants to refuse jingoism, but also still wants to imagine the rejuvenation of that culture through forces from Europe, but re-articulated in a colonial context. But yes, it doesn't imagine that this, if you're interested in the idea of sort of Australian poetry and history, then there's a great book by Justin Clemens and Tom Ford, which is about the governor of Australia who invented the term terra nullius, who was also a poet. And so thinking about the relationship between poetry and the concept of terra nullius in Australia, and thinking about how that, from the very beginning, was always imagined a landscape without people, a landscape that was there to have sublime experiences in, but no one else occupied it. And so that romantic poetic heritage is intrinsically tied to the erasure of Indigenous history.
Thank you. This was amazing. Thank you so much.
Enda.
I mean, fascinating. And it made me sort of, think of Northern Irish, a concept of Northern Irish aesthetics or something, and sort of its weird pivotal role in what you just said, and obviously in the paper. But in a way, I want you, if you would continue what you were saying and talk a little bit about, how could I sum it up? I mean, obviously, wasn't it Essen, the man who spoke to, was encouraged by Synge and Yeats later, and went and wrote the play and founded it. Right. But obviously, the Irish literary project, the Irish drama project was, at least the way I learned about it, it was absolutely about encountering the indigenous. The Synge went to the Aran Islands and had that encounter.
Yep.
So then the Northern Irish, I mean, if we sort of put that there, as opposed to what you just said about, say, Australia and India, the Northern Irish gets to be in a fascinating sort of.
Oh, it is very fascinating. Yeah. Yeah, and this is why the Ulster Literary Theatre is so different from the Irish Literary Theatre, because they have a very different context. This is a context in which they believe that the only way of trying to create an Ulster literature is not to turn to the Irish past, but is to ridicule any mode of turning to the Irish past. So they're ridiculing Yeats and they're ridiculing Synge. So in all of, there's a great little playlet published called The Mists That Do Be on the Bog. So they're really kind of taking the piss out of Synge and others. They're also then writing, there's an amazing play by Gerald McNamara called Thompson and Tir na Nog, which is about an Orangeman who is killed at the mock Battle of Scarva and wakes up in Tir na Nog, and he obviously can't speak Irish, so he's put on trial by the gods, and it's this amazing farce about the incomprehension of Irish and then British cultures in this period. So that's how the Ulster Literary Theatre is trying to deal with its particular cultural context, is by thinking about the ways in which these traditions are incompatible and trying to therefore satirize both at the same time. So Gerald McNamara writes a series of plays that are deeply satirical about Ulster culture and wanting to ridicule it. And that's the only way of trying to maybe create a culture that's for everyone. It's like an equal opportunity satire. Everyone is being abused here. But that's sort of how we work in Northern Ireland. It's the only way we can go.
You know, obviously Northern Ireland didn't exist, right? So it's a kind of a proto-culture form.
Well, it didn't exist, but it certainly, you know, so Thompson and Tir na Nog is published, is first performed in 1912. So once you've got the Ulster Covenant, I mean, Northern Ireland does exist in some ways. It's only a matter of time. So yeah, certainly from, I think there's something interesting about that period of sort of 1900 through to 1912, 1916, and Roy Foster sort of says that there's so much happening, there's so much sort of messiness in terms of ideologies and influences and practices, and they consolidate in 1916 into something, but there's a sense of real diversity, and aestheticism is part of the makeup of Irish culture in this period. But I think it then sort of gets erased a bit by 1916, and there's not really a place for a kind of queer aestheticism in that project. So I think that's one of the sort of interesting things about this period, where there is experimentation, and the experimentation in the north is very different to the experimentation that's happening in Dublin, and they're pitting themselves explicitly against Dublin modes of trying to write a new national drama. So I think, yeah, it's a very rich period before 1916, and really in Northern Ireland before 1912. Once you get to the Ulster Covenant, things do become much more ideologically sort of solidified.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Colleagues, any further questions or observations? Well, if not, I would very much like to thank Alex for a marvelous and hugely illuminating presentation, which certainly has done a lot of course correction for us on the ways in which we might think about British Empire and settler colonialism. I think it's extraordinarily important, so thank you. It's a great pleasure to welcome our next speaker, Ana Rodriguez Navas, and we're so very, very pleased that you're able to join us today. Ana is Professor of Latin American Literature and Culture and Graduate Director for Hispanic Studies at Loyola University in Chicago. And her books include, because she works a lot on the Caribbean, Idle Talk, Deadly Talk, The Uses of Gossip in Caribbean Literature from the University of Virginia Press in 2018, and with Peter Hume, who's so very, very highly regarded as an expert on the Caribbean. Tides of Progress, Anglo-Hispanic Print Culture, 1890 to 1945, from Bloomsbury in 2025. Now, I came to know Ana's research and scholarship through a publication that I have to say Wilde scholarship has yet to really fully engage with, because Wilde scholarship I think this is fair to say, has not been engaging with Latin American studies. So that's one of the many reasons why we are so very grateful that you're able to join us. In 2020, Anna co-edited with Natalie Buzaglo a special issue, I cannot overstate how important this issue is, of the Journal of Latin American Cultural Studies, entitled The Legacy of Oscar Wilde in Latin American Literature and Culture, offering the first in-depth look at Wilde's importance in the region. It's completely eye-opening, not for scholars coming from where you're coming from, but for those of us who come from a somewhat geographically isolated Oscar Wilde studies. So let me welcome you. You're going to guide us through some of the legacies of Wilde and Latin America.
Thank you. Thank you for your introduction. Thank you all for being here. And thank you, Joe and Deaglán, for the invitation. I cannot tell you how thrilled I am to be a part of this, to be learning so much from all of you. And yes, it is just a great pleasure. Thank you also everyone at the center for organizing this. And I'm going to get started. I wanted to say that it is a bit of a daunting task to present on Oscar Wilde and Latin America, just because there is so much. I try to give you a very brief overview at the beginning, and then I'm going to zoom in on a case that I think is extremely important just because of its kind of groundbreaking nature in Puerto Rico and also for Latin America at large. But there is so much here that I could tell you about in the questions, and so I welcome to talking with you all after. And I also wanted to say that in the light of Alex's excellent presentation just now, I'm already rethinking some of the things I'm going to say today. So anyway, I'll get started. One summer afternoon in 1900, the Guatemalan writer Enrique Gómez Carrillo, then living in Paris, invited the young Colombian poet Guillermo Valencia to the Calisaya. This image, I believe, is in your book also. So back here, to the Calisaya, an American bar for a big unexpected surprise. That's a quote. There, Valencia was greeted by a dozen of Paris's most prominent Latin American exiles and expatriates, and the gaunt but instantly recognizable figure of Oscar Wilde, whom Gómez Carrillo introduced as un nuevo poeta hispanoamericano, a new Hispanic-American poet. Seated between Rubén Darío, seated between Rubén Darío and the Venezuelan writer Manuel Díaz Rodríguez, Valencia listened as Wilde held court for 3 hours, discussing, quote, with precision and singular mastery, everything from that year's Exposición Universelle to the merits of various works of art. In his 1912 autobiography, Darío recalls the great disgraced poet speaking French with a heavy accent from across the channel. The group became close, meeting at least twice more before Wilde's death that winter. Valencia presented Wilde with a specially bound edition of one of his works, a very poor tribute to so great a man, and Wilde gave Valencia a dedicated copy of of Henry de Vree's bilingual edition of The Ballad of Reading Gaol, a priceless jewel that inspired Valencia's own translation of the poem. Valencia became the preeminent Colombian poet of his generation and later a prominent politician. Right now there's a national museum in Colombia that used to be his home. But Wilde's status as a poeta hispanoamericano is now all but forgotten. Many Latin American intellectuals once venerated Wilde's luminous prose and incisive critical thought. Over the years, however, reflexive moralizing eclipsed Wilde's literary and critical merits. In the Latin American imagination, Wilde became known and condemned or revered for his queer persona rather than his thought and writing. Few Latin Americans now read Wilde. Fewer still are aware of his role in shaping the region's literary, social, and even political thought during the late 19th and 20th century, or of the Wildean traces that still mark the region's cultural and intellectual life. In a recent JLAC special issue, Natalie Buzaglo and I sought to rescue Wilde's forgotten role in shaping modern Latin American literary, cultural, and sociopolitical identity. Our contention was that the commonalities and differences in the ways in which Wilde has been read, embraced, suppressed, championed, and condemned across Latin America shed important new light both on Wilde and on the region during the fin de siècle and the first several decades of the 20th century. Today, I will attempt to map some of the ways in which Wilde's thought has come to shape the region's intellectual life and evolving cultural and political identity. In this, I will cast Wilde as a key figure for the history of ideas in Latin America. Gómez Carrillo's heralding of Wilde as un nuevo poeta hispanoamericano, after all, reflected mutual fascination and real aesthetic kinship. After meeting in 1891, Wilde and Gómez Carrillo, then just 18, became, as Rivas Bravo notes, such intimate friends that certain rumors circulated that there was more to their relationship than simply personal or literary admiration, end quote. Earlier still, Wilde had grown fascinated by Latin America. Planning his 1882 US tour, Wilde mulled visiting Mexico, quote, to examine the wonderful remains of its ancient art, end quote, and ride on horseback through the rugged scenery. Wilde abandoned the notion, but his interest remained. In The Picture of Dorian Gray, Wilde catalogs Gray's collection of Amazonian, Aztec, Chilean, and Peruvian musical instruments, showing familiarity with colonial chroniclers such as Alonso de Ovalle and Bernal Diaz. In prison, Wilde studied Spanish, requesting grammars and conversation manuals. He also considered settling in Colombia after his release. In Latin American eyes, meanwhile, Wilde was both a serious critical thinker and a larger-than-life celebrity. In a seminal 1992 article, we were talking about this last night, Sylvia Molloy explored, Sylvia Molloy explored José Martí's unsettling encounter with Wilde during his US tour of 1882. Writing after seeing Wilde lecture in New York, Martí exclaims, quote, "Look at Oscar Wilde. He doesn't dress as we do, but in a singular manner. It hurts the eyes to see a chap turned out in the latest waistcoat, pants from the past, a Cromwell hairdo, and a turn-of-the-century dandy's watch chain," end quote. Though not blind to Wilde's critical powers, Molloy writes, Martí's response is filtered through Wilde's transgressive persona. Still, other Latin Americans looked deeper. Jorge Luis Borges, whose first published work at age 9 was a translation of The Happy Prince, is remarkable for his direct engagement with Wilde's work. Of course, Borges' own thought, marked by a refusal to defer to received interpretations, owes much to Wilde. In fact, many concepts considered fundamentally Borgesian and as such critical to Latin American literary thought can be read as reconfigurations of notions first explored by Wilde. Filtered through Borges, Wilde's criticism came to have an enduring and profound, if seldom acknowledged, influence on Latin American cultural production and critical thought. But rather than survey the many points of contact between Wilde and Latin American writers and thinkers, we would be here all year, I want to use our remaining time to zoom in on a case that exemplifies the way Wilde's thought has resonated in the region. The Puerto Rican essayist and politician Miguel Guerra Mondragón, 1880-1947, who emerged as an outspoken champion of Wilde's thought in the 1910s. So this is less than 2 decades after the US takeover of Puerto Rico in 1898. So I want to underscore that for what will follow. Guerra Mondragón was Puerto Rico's most important modernista critic and editor of the vastly influential Revista de las Antillas. He was a prominent politician, a speaker of Puerto Rico's House of Representatives, a lawyer who drafted pioneering legislation charting a course between colonialism and independence, and an advisor on matters literary and political to some of Puerto Rico's most influential public figures. I will talk about this again a little later. He was also a respected and widely read critic and translator of Wilde, who he presented as not only an artist, but also a thinker of enduring relevance to Puerto Rican culture. In 1914, Guerra declared, quote, "Critic and poet, these are the words that come to the lips when one is acquainted with the full works of Oscar Wilde. A critic, I say, but in the most intense sense of the word. A critic like Plato and Aristotle, like Longinus and Plotinus, like Boileau and Sainte-Beuve, like Arnold, like Ruskin, like Pater. That is to say, a philosopher and contemplator of beauty," end quote. Guerra's engagement with Wilde's aestheticism was at odds with the equivocal, moralizing readings that had until then shaped his reception in the Americas, and wove Wilde's thought into Puerto Rican public discourse. In Puerto Rico, Guerra believed, Wilde's ideas could provide the foundation for a modernista cultural program capable of standing apart from Spanish and American cultural hegemony, so the two colonial powers, and forging a Puerto Rican critical identity from first principles. Where Martí struggled to look beyond Wilde's appearance, Guerra Mondragón, himself dapper to the point of dandyism, and many compare his image, his looks, to Oscar Wilde's, mocks those whose macho moralizing distracts them from the merits of Wilde's work. Quote, "What mortal hasn't been part of the general lapidation? On the other hand, few know the glory and worth of the poet, and legion are those who remain unaware of the critic," he writes. The distinction between el hombre Oscar Wilde, the man Oscar Wilde, and the ideas of the abstracted poet-critic is fundamental to Guerra's reading. The former he deems a distraction, but the latter are eternal and glorious. Indeed, those who judge Wilde's morals instead of celebrating his work reveal the coarseness of their critical faculties. In a 1913 letter to the poet and journalist Luis Muñoz Rivera, then serving as Puerto Rico's representative in the US Congress, Guerra writes, quote, "Few here, in this setting where there are so many bodegas and no academies in session, have understood Wilde, being as he is, so brilliant." End quote. Striving to explain the significance of Wilde to his own intellectual development, he recalls an episode in 1910 when Muñoz Rivera criticized his legal writing, so Guerra's. Quote, "Since then I learned this great truth. Ideas without style and ideas given beautiful form are very different things. Form is everything, as Wilde would incisively say," he writes. It was the marriage of idea and form, of stylistic and conceptual beauty, that drew Guerra to Wilde. Quote, "Wilde is a prince of concept and form. Caught up in the worthy desire to introduce him to the intellectual nation, I began to translate him and put my best effort into it," he writes. Guerra soon learned, however, that simply translating Wilde's works would not be enough to convey their beauty and significance to Puerto Rican readers. He complains, quote, "In the eyes of the public, the figure of the critic was eclipsed by that of the author of Salome," end quote. Guerra Mondragón does not blame such distractions on the decadence of Wilde's play, of which, after all, he published his own translation. I will discuss this later. Rather, he laments that audiences engage with it merely as a scandal and fail to grasp its merits. Quote, "It is clear that this drama was written neither for children nor for the gentle bourgeois of London and New York," he writes in a scathing prologue to his translation. "That would have been a precious waste of time. It would have been better to introduce the cook to the postulates of Euclides or to explain Newton's binomial to the driver," end quote. There is obviously a snobbery to Guerra's framing. To appreciate Wilde's thought is to join an elite capable of grasping that which few know and few here have understood. His proselytization on Wilde's behalf thus exhorts Puerto Rico's intellectual elite to recognize the value of Wilde's thought, in part by recasting responses shaped by queer panic as merely gauche, plebeian failures of taste and refinement rather than displays of moral rectitude. It is fascinating to read such efforts in light of a 1916 letter to Frank Simmons, the author of They Shall Not Pass, which Guerra offered to translate into Spanish. Noting his past translations of Wilde, he used this as calling card, Guerra adds parenthetically, quote, "We Latins, although viral haters of the man of Reading jail, are great admirers of the wonderful artist whose name was Oscar Wilde. Free from the fatal contagion of prudery, we are able to discern between the moral and the beautiful. In other words, we keep Plato away from the priest. It is the great one lesson taught us by Greece, Rome, and France," end quote. Writing to an American, Guerra subtly here shifts his framing. Though he nods to the distortions of performative machismo, he also suggests that Latins can see Wilde's worth more clearly from a distance than is possible for Anglo-American readers. Clearly, such statements are aspirational. As Guerra acknowledges, Wilde's critical thought was often eclipsed by his scandals, particularly in Latin America. Still, such a vision, combined with the seriousness of Guerra's critical engagement, represents a very important early Spanish-American attempt to disrupt moralistic readings, or purely moralistic readings, of Wilde's work. Guerra's efforts to situate Wilde in the Puerto Rican imaginary were facilitated by the scant attention his works had previously received. With few translations, Wilde didn't gain a significant readership in Spain until the mid-1910s. In the Spanish-speaking Americas, Guerra's 1913 translations here of The Critic as Artist and The Decay of Lying were among the earliest Spanish renderings, and it was chiefly through them that the text became known in Puerto Rico and in other Latin American countries. The same is not necessarily true of Salome, which had been first translated in 1902 and later in 1907. The second translator is Gómez Carrillo, who I mentioned early on. A Spanish version of this dramatic work by Oscar Wilde is no novelty for the literary world. Guerra Mondragón writes, quote, I have read various Salomes, but all so poor and unfaithful that, to be frank, I wasn't the least discouraged either when I began or when I completed this task. As an early translator and critic, then, Guerra Mondragón was well placed to shape Wilde's reception in the Spanish-speaking world. His efforts were especially consequential because of his role alongside the poet and independence advocate Luis Llorens Torres and the writer and suffrage campaigner Nemesio Canales, editing the Revista de las Antillas, which we saw earlier. Guerra Mondragón variously edited the Revista's literature, philosophy, culture, and art sections, and contributed essays peppered with references to and quotations from Wilde, and with unattributed glosses on Wilde's ideas as he laid the theoretical foundations of modernismo. He also launched the Biblioteca Americana, and this is very important, series, which distributed volumes by acclaimed autores americanos, so American authors, and America, this is in the sense of the continent, obviously, to the Revista subscribers. Guerra Mondragón's Oscar Wilde, Estudio y Traducciones, containing The Decay of Lying and The Critic as Artist, along with a lengthy critical essay, constituted the second volume in the Biblioteca Americana series. And this was a veritable pantheon of key figures in modernismo. So this is absolutely mind-blowing, honestly. This remarkable gesture placed Wilde's works within a Caribbean and specifically Puerto Rican pantheon alongside revolutionary works promoting the independence of the Antilles, sorry, that was a quote, by writers including Llorens Torres, Pérez Pierret, and Eugenio María Hostos. So absolutely essential figures both in politics and letters at the time. This was a uniquely celebrated group of Puerto Rican authors gathered with the specific goal of celebrating a Puerto Rican canon and addressing questions of Puerto Rican nationhood. This, of course, makes Wilde's inclusion all the stranger and more significant. Clearly, Wilde's texts were prized by other members of Guerra's circle. In a 1913 letter, Muñoz Rivera praises Guerra Mondragón's work, quote, the Spanish translator rises to the heights of the English writer, and that's really saying something. Wilde doesn't have rivals. He's unique, singular, as erudite as Voltaire, finer than Théophile Gautier, deeper than Émile Faguet, more subtle and elegant than anyone. He strikes me as a prince of concept and of form, a prince at once utterly fantastic yet utterly masterful, end quote. A revista notice promoting Estudio y Traducciones similarly emphasizes the refinement needed to appreciate Wilde's work. Quote, Wilde's studies, we add, are only accessible to members of the public, both very cultured and very well educated in matters of art. It is necessary to possess abundant intellectual refinement to understand and properly appreciate this illustrious critic, who in his home country of England has still not been well appreciated and understood. His book will fall from the hands of vulgar people, end quote. The Revista amplifies Guerra's assertion that moralistic readings of Wilde betray vulgarity, and that sophisticated Puerto Ricans may be more able than English readers to understand Wilde's merits. The notice thus asserts the possibility of building a Puerto Rican culture that, even if accessible only to the elite, bears comparison with the centers of global culture. The affinity Guerra perceives between Wilde's critical sensibility and his own is grounded in the belief that the artist must break with both past and present and build something eternal. Describing San Juan's literary scene in 1914, Guerra asserts that, quote, there are men whom the period and the place do not affect in the least. Such men, he argues, affirm Wilde's assertion that art never expresses, quote, the genius of the era, the spirit of its time, or the social and moral conditions that surround it, but rather more fundamental truths. Art, this is a quote, art, says the admirable author of The Decay of Lying, never expresses anything other than itself. Pure art rejects the weight of the human spirit, end quote. For Guerra, this was a vital point. In an Americanized Puerto Rico, the notion that artists could work independently of their context implied the possibility of shrugging off American encroachment and the burden of a Spanish colonial past, and seeking out truths that express the deeper reality of the Puerto Rican condition. This is essential to Guerra's blueprint for his island. In a passage that stands as a cultural manifesto, Guerra calls for a, quote, vigorous literary movement anchored not in ambient ideas or pragmatism, but in aestheticized idealism. Caliban sought to conquer the collective soul, but the coveted conquest did not take place, he writes. Quote, a group of intellectuals stood apart from the mercantile cohort and preached doctrines, blazed paths, and reaffirmed old historical ideals. The lyres resounded, eloquence spoke out, pens wrote luminous words. The reaction prevailed, and our art reflected it. Our art, then, is not a reflection of this time, of this feverishly commercial San Juan. It is not a reflection of things as they are, but of things as they should be, and one day will finally become. End quote. Caliban, a nod both to Wilde, of course, and to José Enrique Rodó's influential essay Ariel, and we can also talk about that later, symbolizes Americanized pragmatism, but also the way colonialism and commercialism were infecting the Puerto Rican people with a brutish cultural sensibility. American culture may encroach upon the collective soul, but Puerto Ricans are complicit, subsuming themselves into Calibanesque cultural mediocrity. Against this backdrop, the elite are Ariel's defenders. In Guerra's reading, a vigorous cultural force capable of illuminating a path forwards for Puerto Rico. Artists, Guerra argues, stand as beacons, revealing both beauty and beautiful ideas. But Guerra goes further than many modernistas, suggesting that ideas sustained through art are not simply beautiful abstractions, but materialize into and shape the future as they gain cultural currency. Following Wilde, Guerra thus places the individual artist at the center of his aesthetic thought and broader nation-building program, and argues that viewing an artist as the expression of their age diminishes both their shortcomings and their successes. Quote, it is very easy to dismiss an issue of literary criticism by holding the age responsible for the triteness and bad verses of a poet, he writes. That such and such a poet is mediocre? Well, blame the age, an abstraction, and end of story. End quote. For Guerra, this critical complacency devalues art itself, but also forsakes the artist's vital duty to break with and thereby reimagine and reinvigorate their society. Read in this light, Guerra Mondragon's assertion that for the artist, all things have a soul, is revealed not simply as a parroting of Wilde's aesthetic principles, but as an attempt to marshal aestheticism in order to spur active engagement, at once artistic, critical, and political, with Puerto Rico's national condition. Quote, Wilde's criticism was a battering ram against that photographic art and contributed more than any other to steer his country's artistic activity towards new paths, Guerra writes. A similar imperative is needed in Puerto Rico, he implies, with the struggle against realism serving to peel away inadequate artistic forms and usher in a new cultural sensibility. What Guerra seeks, and ultimately finds, in Wilde is ideological support for his effort to create an aesthetic roadmap for Puerto Rican cultural renewal, independently of either Spanish or American influence. Wilde's emphasis on individual critical responses as the building blocks of culture provides Guerra with a theoretical framework as he exhorts his compatriots to create the age on their own terms, and also resonates with his circle's broader democratizing program. With aestheticism and modernismo leading the way, Guerra suggests, individual Puerto Ricans will be free to transcend their colonized, corrupted, and complacent cultural moment, and forge a robust and authentic cultural identity as a first step towards political independence. Of course, there are limits to Guerra Mondragon's democratic impulse. By asserting the power of individual visionaries, Guerra secures for himself and his cohort a position as cultural leaders and delegitimizes those who fail to live up to his standards. He grudgingly admits that industrialization, quote, has democratized the world, but he sees egalitarianism as a leveling process that yields, quote, luxuries and cheap pleasures in equal measure. Similarly, Guerra saw Americanization not as democratizing culture, but as, quote, turning life into an immense market where everything is priced and sold, ideas, sexual love, love of country, honor, and convictions. The natural consequence of this state of affairs is the enthronement of a mediocrity that knows nothing of beauty in either art or life, end quote. Guerra's reading of Wilde, in short, rests upon a kind of cultural aristocracy. As the unthinking masses fall prey to Calibanesque cultural erosion, only the Arielista elite can secure a cultural future for their island. Quote, it falls to us to be the Ariel of the Americans and keep Caliban within his domains. It is up to us to disseminate art, ideals, and beauty, to be masters of life, end quote. If Guerra Mondragon's reading of Wilde allows him to subvert and resist American cultural encroachment, it also allows him to preserve his circle's cultural role as his circle's role as cultural gatekeepers, cementing an intellectual primacy that extends beyond the literary and cultural to encompass his associates' nation-building ambitions. Like Wilde, Guerra was both fascinated and troubled by the United States. When Guerra Mondragón writes of this feverishly commercial San Juan, he echoes Wilde's critique of the crude commercialism of America. The United States, Wilde warns, is vulgarizing mankind with its materializing spirit, its indifference to the poetical side of things, and its lack of imagination and of high unattainable ideals. The idealized art towards which Guerra urges Puerto Ricans to strive is an explicit attempt to push back against what Wilde calls the chilling touch of commercialism, and to assert an artistic program attuned to the deeper spirit of Puerto Rico rather than imported US culture. This optimistic vision of art's transformative power is far removed from long-standing portrayals of aestheticism as effete and ineffectual. In Wilde's thought, Guerra finds an aesthetic credo capable of countering the cultural distortions of American imperialism. In prioritizing Wilde's critical thought, Guerra recalls early Spanish responses to Wilde, Spanish as in from Spain, where proponents of aestheticism had gravitated to Wilde as a theorist. Still, Guerra looked past Wilde's public persona in a way that eluded his peers, consolidating Wilde's thought into a critical framework capable of solidifying modernismo's internationalism while shifting its gaze away from colonial models. Wilde's work could be mined all the more freely because it was, quote-unquote, English, as some people in his circle called it, rather than American or Spanish. Removed from Puerto Rico's immediate political reality, it allowed Guerra to frame his cultural project without paying tribute to the imperial centers then shaping Latin America. Puerto Rican intellectuals' engagement with Guerra's ideas often sparked a deeper appreciation of Wilde's thought. In a 1914 letter, the playwright and poet Eugenio Astol, I missed that one, okay. Eugenio Astol credited Wilde Estudio y Traducciones, Guerra's first translation of Wilde's essays, with transforming Puerto Rican literature. Quote, "With your book, you opened a new path in Puerto Rico, that of the study of foreign literature," he writes. Quote, "Such a model was sorely needed here because our localism and our literary tropicalismo have grown unbearable for people of refined taste," end quote. Such exchanges show the zeal with which Guerra circulated his translations. When the Madrid-based Venezuelan writer and editor Rufino Blanco Fombona, published an unauthorized edition of his Wilde translations, Guerra quickly began circulating the pirated volume. Quote, "They have been collected in a book without my permission and without consulting me, by the way, by the great writer Blanco Fombona." He bragged in 1922 to Isauro Gabaldon, the Filipino commissioner in Washington. Another fascinating exchange comes in the form of a handwritten page, undated, but signed by the Colombian writer Samuel Lopez, given the full text of Lopez's translation of Wilde's prose poem, The Artist, which appeared in the influential Buenos Aires journal Nosotros in 1909. It is impossible to discern whether Lopez sent the manuscript to Guerra Mondragón in advance of publication, perhaps for feedback, or subsequently, as a mark of literary kinship. Either way, the document, let's see. Either way, the document represents a tantalizing connection between Guerra and Nosotros, which also published important translations of Salomé in 1910, The Decay of Lying in 1911, a fragment of De Profundis in 1913, a commentary on Salomé in 1913, and a translation of The Selfish Giant in 1914. The connection is especially significant given the importance of Nosotros to Argentine literature and Spanish-American literature more broadly. The journal also published work by Borges and by José Bianco, who later edited the influential Argentinian magazine Sur, where Borges and many of his cohort had their start. Guerra also used personal relationships to promote Wilde's thought. In 1913, for instance, he hosted Monday night meetings at which he, Llorens Torrens, Astol, and Pérez Pierret discussed art and literature. Quote, "Guerra Mondragón was an admirable conversationalist, fusing a phlegmatic English tone and an emotional Spanish fluidity. He elaborated on the life and writings of Oscar Wilde, drawing on a vast culture rooted in Oxford," end quote. Similar gatherings also took place on the balcony of Muñoz Rivera's family home. Of Muñoz Rivera's family home. where Guerra held court before writers including Canales, Llorens Torres, Pérez Pierret, and Fernández Vanga. Many names, I know. According to Muñoz Rivera's son, Luis Muñoz Marín, who later became Puerto Rico's first governor, Guerra Mondragón led discussions, quote, on works by Bernard Shaw and on English Fabian socialism, and analyzed De Profundis and the Ballad of Reading Gaol by Oscar Wilde, so ahead of his time, end quote. Notably, Muñoz Marín became an avid reader of Wilde and wrote poems inspired by his work. Similar reverberations can be found in Canales' critical essays, in which, as César Ayala and Rafael Bernabe note, inclusivity and elitism converge into a vision of an irreverent and egalitarian and simultaneously elegant and aristocratic socialism. Scholars have largely overlooked, however, connections between Wilde and Canales' literary work. In Mi Voluntad se ha muerto, it's a 1921 novella, for instance, the protagonist falls into an erotic rapture while his lover reads Wilde's works to him. Quote, she began to read me a fragment of the exquisite prose of the great English poet. My eyes closed for a moment, and in her voice, the poet's accent acquired such a divinely evocative power that when she stopped reading, I begged like a child, more and more and more. And suddenly, in an irresistible impetus of frenzied admiration, I seized the book and kissed it repeatedly, end quote. Canales mobilizes Wilde as a provocation. His unmentioned transgressions play an intertextual role, dispelling the protagonist's inhibitions. Even as Guerra dedicated himself to politics and law, his writings introduced Wilde to a new generation of Puerto Rican writers. In 1925, the young poet Gustavo Agreit dedicated an article to Guerra, calling him, quote, one of the most accurate translators of the Wildean oeuvre and perhaps the foremost in revealing his thought. In his reply, Guerra recalled the challenges he had once faced in promoting Wilde's thought. Quote, I became the target, I remember it well, of 1,000 boorish cornerstone wisecracks born of a general atmosphere of Pharisaism. And he praises Agreit's sophistication in recognizing Wilde's continuing relevance. Having long urged poets to break with the past, Guerra stands in an uneasy relationship with his own legacy. But he sees Wilde as deeply salient to the new cultural moment, and is eager to underscore his own hard-won success in securing for Wilde's thought a lasting place in Puerto Rico's cultural life. Guerra's insistence on the power of art betrays a degree of anxiety about the efficacy of nation-building efforts anchored in the artistic and cultural spheres. In an unpublished essay, Guerra writes that, quote, without art, we could not show the way to the heights. Still, Guerra frets that artistic idealism is fighting a losing battle. Quote, the nascent aristocracy of money, begotten of industrialism and of failed democracy, intimately disdains talent. Vulgarity is instinctively leveling, and a man of talent would upset the comfortable social equilibrium. It would be like a mountain disrupting the monotony of a desert, end quote. Guerra seeks to mobilize an insurgent cultural aristocracy capable of countering the aristocracy of money. In so doing, however, he signals that the artist, hitherto presented as existing outside time, in fact stands in a more complex relationship with her cultural context. Despite Guerra's insistence that art stands apart from the context of its creation, his doctrine demands concrete cultural interventions, a contradiction manifested in Guerra's own literary endeavors, which sought not simply to imagine a new cultural trajectory, but to realize that trajectory through direct action. He sought, in fact, to forge a brand of politically charged, specifically nationalist modernismo that would cement a Puerto Rican national identity. The weight Guerra gives to interventions in the public sphere may explain why, after 1914, he shelved his literary projects to work as a lawyer and politician. In a 1922 letter, Guerra wistfully offered Gabaldon, the Filipino commissioner I mentioned earlier, copies of his Wilde translations. Quote, these are works of my period of literary enthusiasm, of art fever, now unfortunately consumed in the almost cold ashes of the practical and elegant life that our profession imposes on us. It is unclear what Gabaldon, an advocate of Filipino independence, made of the gift. Still, it is notable that it was sent during the period in which Guerra drafted the Campbell Bill, and this is very important, the first congressional legislation seeking Puerto Rican self-governance. Did Guerra's engagement with Wilde's thought shape his new focus on politics? We can talk about this in the questions. Certainly, the alliances he forged in championing Wilde served him well. In 1917, Muñoz Marín, upon whom Guerra's discourses had made such an impression, gave speeches endorsing Guerra's House candidacy. Wilde's impact on Guerra's political program, however, is harder to discern. Aestheticism, like Latin American modernismo, has been accused of sterility, with Lisa Davis and other critics perceiving a rift with its contextual reality. In Puerto Rico, however, Guerra's career offers a tantalizing glimpse of a bridge between aestheticism and a practical political program grounded in cultural rejuvenation and nation building. Many of the conflicts that Wilde faced, or now embodies, have been and remain similarly central to the question of Puerto Rican identity. This is not to say that Guerra and his circle saw Wilde as a direct bridge between Irish nationalism and their own nation-building efforts. The nuances of Wilde's Anglo-Irish persona were not always clear to Puerto Rican readers. We've seen some examples of this. And Wilde is often referred to, even in the Revista, simply as an Englishman. Still, Guerra and others did look to Ireland as a model for Puerto Rico, and Wilde's thought on the relationship between art, empire, and Irish identity do resonate with Guerra's efforts to promote a Puerto Rican Estado Libre Asociado. If nothing else, Guerra clearly saw his Wildean aestheticism as intimately connected to his political program. As Ayala and Bernabé note, quote, Guerra Mondragon's literary anti-realism was linked to a consistently reformist pragmatism in the political sphere, end quote. This pragmatism was not a rejection of Wilde's idealism, but rather an attempt to realize its goals through political action. Not, as Davis argues, an aesthetic detachment from reality, but rather an attempt to force aestheticism into conversation with the social collective. In this way, Guerra made aestheticism a key component of an envisioned culturally and politically independent Puerto Rican identity. What is at stake in this modernista renewal of literature, then, is nothing less than the future of Puerto Rican culture, and even, perhaps naively, of Puerto Rico itself. If poetry were to become, quote, a mere rhetorical game, one more bauble, one more honorific title to dazzle the credulous bourgeoisie, Guerra argues, then, quote, art, noble and sanctified art, will suffer a profane death, and with it will die our culture, the true and unique spiritual culture of the country, end quote. Guerra's insistence upon creating a new art of the present, and especially the future, is a direct response to the existential cultural threat he perceived as posed by the United States, the new colonial power. No other intellectual of the period shared this conviction with such intensity, nor shared Guerra's fervor for breaking with their literary past and establishing a new cultural vocabulary for their island. In Wilde, however, Guerra found a kindred spirit, a writer deeply engaged with questions fundamental to his own project and whose work, like his life, was marked by paradoxes, unresolved tensions, and an enduring sense of isolation and otherness. Guerra's great contribution to Puerto Rican letters lay in his ability to move past Wilde's moral paradoxes, to resist the, quote, fatal contagion of prudery, and refocus his readers' attention on Wilde's critical value. In so doing, Guerra incorporated Wilde's aestheticism into a thoroughly original vision of modernismo, deeply attuned to both the cultural distortions of colonialism and the need to promote a new cultural identity for Puerto Rico. While Guerra Mondragón himself ultimately drifted away from artistic endeavors, his critical approach to Wilde echoed through Puerto Rico's literary and political discourses in the decades to come. Similar echoes of Wilde linger throughout Latin America. From the early gatherings in Paris, to the translations and commentaries of Guerra Mondragón, to the essays and fictions of Borges, Wilde's poetry and criticism left deep impressions. Readings of Wilde were often intertwined with cultural elitism. This was, after all, an era when politics, literature, and even nation-building were the domains of a small intellectual vanguard, particularly in Latin America. As opportunities for cultural participation widened, with mass literacy in Puerto Rico in the early 20th century, this was part of the American political program for the island, for instance, the urgency of looking beyond Wilde's celebrity to mark one's own refinement faded, and the direct experience of Wilde's thought was once more eclipsed by his public persona. Still, traces of Wilde's thought remain, and we see this in Borges, as I mentioned earlier. Exploring them yields important insights about Latin American culture, but also about Wilde's own status as a transnational thinker, not just an Anglo-Irish figure, but also, as his Latin American friends half-joked that afternoon in Paris, a new, vital, and perennially relevant Hispanic American poet. Thank you.
That was a tour de force. How extraordinary. How many people know about this outside Puerto Rican cultural history and politics and art?
Not many at all. I would say not even in Puerto Rico. As I was saying yesterday to Kristen, Puerto Rico has had such a charged 20th and 21st century. Every week is a century. So, you know, what happened 10 years ago is already forgotten. It is, you know. One thing that I would have liked to say and sort of explore a little bit more, Puerto Rico is the only nation in Latin America that has never been a republic. Right. It went from colonial, from Spanish hands to American hands. And so, you know, it is, a very complicated and difficult
its history is so different
reality.
From the Dominican Republic.
Yes.
I think, Greg, you wanted to ask a question.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Anna. That was spectacular. I'm fascinated by Guerra Mondragon's evocation of Wilde via Shakespeare, and in that, you know, I mean, I know he's getting Ariel and Caliban from the critical dialogues and from other places, but is he giving us a sense of Puerto Rico as Prospero's island? You know, because of course the uptake of The Tempest is very much about as a kind of allegory of empire and colonialism.
Yes.
So that resonance just really struck out to me, and I wonder what he's doing with Shakespeare standing behind Wilde there.
So I, you know, like I said at the beginning, I could have taken this in so many different directions. This is such a fertile sort of field. But what is interesting about your question is that it isn't just Shakespeare and it isn't just Wilde. It is also José Enrique Rodó, who is a very important critical figure in Latin America at the time. And so in 1900, Rodó publishes his very celebrated essay, Ariel, which talks precisely about the threat of the US and the way that the Americas, as he thinks of them, have to respond to it. So the vision of Ariel and Caliban was absolutely everywhere in Latin America at the time. And honestly, this is one of the places where it continues. So I don't know, and this is something that I have wanted to do research on for a very long time, whether Rodó himself got it through Wilde or where it came from exactly. It is interesting to me that he published it in 1900, right? We all know what that year means. But one thing that is fascinating is that if tomorrow you told a Latin American what are the 3 most important essays in the history of Latin America, that one would be one. So it is, to me, extraordinary. And again, there is research there that is vitally important that needs to be done. So, yeah.
Kristen.
I have 2 questions. One thing I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about is the reception of this work when you present it at like Latin American Studies conferences. How this work is getting taken up. I know you did that special issue. What the interest looks like, because I agree with Joe. Like we need to be taking an aestheticism and decadence, and we need to be engaging with this more. But I'm wondering about how the reception of that has operated when you've presented that work to Latin American Studies audiences. The other question I had was about, you're talking about kind of this particular tradition of taking up Wilde being about kind of, I think you use the terminology of like moving past like moral paradoxes. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about traditions of the taking up of Wilde, like in Puerto Rico in particular, but maybe in the Caribbean more generally, that do center upon thinking about him as an influential figure because of his sexual dissidence and because of that, like kind of inaugurating a particular kind of like queer modernist tradition.
Yes, yes, both great questions. So in regards to the first, I will say that the reaction tends to be, oh, fascinating. And then people will come up and say, well, I know that, you know, such and such in Cuba wrote an essay or wrote like a review of Wilde's, et cetera. And so you begin kind of like finding these nuggets. And of course, the sort of the connection with Borges is known in that Borges wrote explicitly about Wilde. And one of his, like, you know, bon mot is something like, Wilde is always right. You know, he said that at some point. But I think the sort of deeper influence, the deeper importance of Wilde is just not well known at all. And, like we were talking about earlier on, it sort of begs more work. So that's the first thing. In response to the second one, it is interesting that there are, as we know, various wilds that circulate simultaneously, right? And so in Puerto Rico, Guerra Mondragon was such a respected figure, such an influential theorist. To be clear, he never wrote very much in terms of poetry, or he was an essayist. That what he said tended to go, although, like I said, he says that he received criticism from some people, etc. However, for instance, the queer vision of Wilde circulated in Mexico. There's a very important figure in early 20th century Mexico, Salvador Novo, who adopted also a Wilde persona, who wrote about Wilde, who was inspired by Wilde. Similarly, in other countries, there was quite a lot of that at the same time. Rubén Darío condensed it. José Martí seems to have his moment of queer panic that I mentioned earlier, right? And so it is very case by case, I would say. But one last thing I wanted to say is that my colleague Natalie Busaglo, with whom we created this special issue of JLAX, wrote about the way that that Wilde was mobilized. Let me go back to my first slide. In Colombia, when we talked about, here, no, not that, here, about Gómez Carrillo and Guillermo Valencia. So this also begs more study. Gómez Carrillo, as I said, it was an intimate friend of Wilde's. They had been, it wasn't just like when Wilde was ostracized in Paris, but they had a long-standing friendship. And, there is work there that is important. But Guillermo Valencia actually published in 1936 a translation of the Ballad of Reading Gaol that was very much a conservative reading of that, and saying, no, you need to look at the profundist. That is the Wilde, right? While at the same time, this was a riposte to another poet who had written a very queer, let's say, tribute to Wilde, etc. And so Guillermo Valencia, who wound up being a very conservative politician, said, well, I knew him, right? And that's how he opens his study. I knew him. We were friends at the Calisaya in Paris, etc., etc. This is the reading. And so this attempt to constantly mobilize Wilde, but also constantly control what Wilde circulates, I think is one of the most fascinating aspects about just reading Wilde in Latin America.
Thank you so much. We need to thank you so warmly and gratefully, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
So we will be adjourning for some refreshments, and we will come back into this room in about 10 to 15 minutes' time.
Hello again. It's an absolute pleasure once more to introduce another speaker, and particularly Kate Hext. Kate is Associate Professor in Decadent Literature at and the Arts, at the University of Exeter, and is also Visiting Professor of English at Iwa Women's University in Seoul. Please forgive my mispronunciation. Kate's most recent monograph was the brilliant Wilde in the Dream Factory, Decadence and Hollywood, just published in 2024, and her new edition of Oscar Wilde's plays was published by Oxford World's Classics in March 2025. It's the go-to edition, really, in that series. She's the co-editor with Alex Murray of the recent Oxford Handbook of Oscar Wilde, of course, and editor of the Cambridge Companion to Walter Pater, published in March 2025. Kate sometimes writes in the TLS, the Times Literary Supplement, most recently about a lost early 20th century garden, on which subject you're now writing a book. And this also has a Wildean twist on the history of English gardens. Kate's most Wildean project at the moment is a new Oxford World's Classics edition or collection of his dialogues and essays, which is actually really exciting as well. And we're very much looking forward to reading that. So, Kate, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Declan, and thanks to everybody. I've been having such a wonderful time here. I quite forgot I had to give a paper too. Thank you for still being here, and I can only echo everyone else, the other speakers, in most sincerely thanking Joe and Declan and our hosts here at the Clark. Thank you, it's been wonderful. And I must also begin with an apology, because this isn't the paper on your handouts. I think on the wing, and I've written a bit about Wilde and cinema before, as Declan said. So I started to think about another way that Wilde is animated in dancing. How would Oscar Wilde dance? Might he polka or waltz? Might he, like Arthur Symons, sit in the stalls and watch the painted dancers? Could we fast forward him into the 70s? I think he'd be too individualistic to do the hustle, but maybe he could try a pirouette a la Rod Stewart to Do You Think I'm Sexy? I'm not quite sure of the kinetic dimensions of Wilde's personal commitments to pleasure, but he vividly imagined its possibility, the possibility of dancing. Wilde's cinematic imagination is something that I've written about and many other people have written about, but I think he also had a choreographic imagination. We see it in the fairy stories, we see it in some of his poetry, we see it in his letters occasionally, we see it, of course, in Salome. The early 20th century embraced this dancing Wilde. It played a part in his global popularity and in the generative effects of his work, as these works defined modern consciousness. Wilde's dancing, I suggest anyway, but please do disagree. I don't think Wilde's dancing is Wildean, or at least it's a different version of Wilde, not Wilde the quipster. And it suggests dimensions of his imagination that sometimes slip away from modern critical attention. He had an eye for spontaneous, sincere, sparky movements in other people, and he often notes moving feet and people's movements. When feet move in Wilde, emotions and personality feel themselves in those feet, I think. Feet aren't epigrammatic for Wilde. Feet, as Shakira did not write, do not lie. The way in which Wilde thought about his own dramatic work, the way in which Wilde thought about his own dramatic work tends toward the form of the solo dance. It will not surprise you to learn. The solo dance was beginning to really emerge at the fin de siècle as a singularly creative form. Before that, here we are, before that, in the early 19th century, or at least until the early 19th century, there was a long history of combining dance and etiquette on stage in court ballet. This demonstrably changed by the 1890s, but it was really with Marius Peptita's choreography for the Nutcracker Suite that we see a new era in dancing, particularly then in the Russian ballet, and before the Russian ballet became the ballet, which happens in the early 20th century. Peptita's choreography for the Nutcracker put more emphasis on the individual performer, the virtuoso and the pas de deux, more on that than on the large spectacle ballets that really defined and continue to define other works. I'm not suggesting that Wilde was influenced by Peptita. I don't know whether he read about the very mixed reviews of Sleeping Beauty in 1890, or the similarly mixed reviews of the Nutcracker in 1893. And that vision of ballet wasn't, as I say, realized outside Russia until at least a decade later, and it wasn't really appreciated in Russia either at that point. But what I want to suggest is that he was channeling the same kind of cultural shifts toward expressive individualism that defined that turn in ballet. And it was encouraged in his case by a vision of art that aspires to the condition of music, and which is inextricably connected to his individualism. Thus, after prison, as Wilde cast around for a project, he reflected on his aims for drama. This is what he wrote. He aimed for a personal drama as a personal mode of expression, as the lyric or the sonnet, while enriching the characterization of the stage and enlarging its artistic horizon. I mentioned his choreographic imagination a little while ago, and this is Megan Girdwood's term in her wonderful book, Modernism and the Choreographic Imagination. In that book, she features Salome, but she really focuses on the imagination, the choreographic imaginations of Wilde's interpreters. And what I'm suggesting is that Wilde too had a choreographic imagination, one which ranges widely and which takes us back as well to his ambitions as a writer and as well as a dramatist. So in this letter, as some of you will know, he says as well that he achieves this vision in Salome, and in Salome only. And of course, it's in Salome that we have the most famous example of Wilde dancing, ironically, in a play where dance is conspicuous by its omission in what he wrote. Here, and it was mentioned yesterday, but Salome dances the dance of the seven veils. This minimalist and very familiar description indicates the place where words run out into the pure movement and personal expression of Salome, suggested in that 1897 letter. By this point, though, Salome has spent the whole play on the verge of dancing. She has a body made to dance, and when she first appears, Naboth describes her as like a princess who has little white doves for feet. One might fancy she was dancing. There are various references to dancing in the subsequent text. A brief pause here, because we might remember that in The Critic as Artist, Wilde idealizes words winged with light. And words for Wilde, like Salome's feet, are always trying to defy gravity, in at least one sense. Yesterday, we began with some parallels between him and Friedrich Nietzsche as two biological degenerates, but they're also the writers of the dance. Nietzsche, too, thought about ideas, not organized into systems, but words that were set in motion like dances. He talks about one should have still enough chaos within to give birth to a dancing star, and every day is wasted when you don't dance at least once. Both of those quotes are from Zarathustra. Aby Warburg in 1908 wrote about Nietzsche and dance, and he linked Nietzsche's will to dance back to Dionysian reverie and like a sort of a re-emergence of Dionysian reverie in the present. I think, and I just mentioned it, I wouldn't have mentioned it, but because it was mentioned yesterday, I just want to link back to that and suggest that we see a parallel in Wilde, where Wilde is also, I think, channeling a re-emergent classical spirit, but one that looks back to Pater's cycles in the Renaissance, and back to that kind of Dionysian reverie that Pater's invested in. But I digress, and I want to get back to Salome, because when Wilde coined the phrase, the Dance of the Seven Veils, he's not only signalling the moment of the plot's climax and the moment when Salome finally takes wing and begins to dance, but he's doing so cognizant, it seems, that he was at the dawn of a modern solo dance, modern solo dancing. With Salome, Wilde, like Peptita, is creating new terms for expression, and the expression of emotional experience on stage, not decorum, but pure expression of the self. Wilde's early 20th century interpreters are vividly aware of this, some irreverently so, and I promised yesterday that I would mention Fatih Arbuckle, Roscoe Arbuckle. There he is, and I want you to, I don't have time to mention it, but to do more than mention it, but I want you to look for it on YouTube. I'm not talking about Roscoe Arbuckle, but I'm talking about something more highbrow than Roscoe Arbuckle, but arguably less fun. So a lot of people did Salome skits, and that's how one of the ways in which Salome enters the global consciousness, actually global consciousness. But it was Richard Strauss, of course, who tried to meet Wilde on his own terms and tried to find a new language in music to express what Wilde suggests in the playtext. In order to do that, Strauss brought new instruments into his orchestra for the 1905 Salome opera. These were a heckelphone, a harmonia, a celesta, an E-flat clarinet, all meant to capture the dissonant squeals and tensions that are the musical counterpart to Salome's spoken language in the play. One unimpressed critic who was writing after the failed Met premiere wrote, "There are no words in any language to express certain symbolic suggestions. Accordingly, several new instruments, some of them fearfully and wonderfully made, like the sounds they produce, had to be invented for this production." She wasn't impressed, as you can tell. But Wilde's stated aim of enlarging the artistic horizon of the theatre was being realised, or beginning to be realised, with Richard Strauss. And it had an obvious appeal to the next generations of artists in dance as well. Artists who were looking toward a total art, as Strauss did, as well as Wilde did, and those included, probably most influentially, Sergei Diaghilev and Mikhail Fokine, who were two of the founders of the Ballet Russe. It was almost inevitable that Salome would be adapted by the Ballet Russe. Diaghilev's magazine, Mir Ukostova, here on the side, World of Art, was founded in 1899, and it was rooted in Wilde's aestheticism. Wilde's playtext also mirrors the kind of Orientalism that was very popular in Russian ballet. So those kind of themes, as well as the kind of raciness of Salome, had an obvious appeal. But there were other reasons too, reasons that go beyond the Ballet Russe, that go beyond the Salome production, why dancing was appealing to interpretations of Wilde in Europe in the 1900s. His name, as you know, and the scandal associated with it went before his actual works in Europe, and certainly a long way before his social comedies. Everyone had heard of the tragedy, the scandal of Oscar Wilde, which was widely reported around Europe, as well, of course, as we know, around the world. But there was the problem of translation. Wilde in Europe could not be Wilde the wit, or not in the same way, not primarily at least. And with Wilde's celebrity built on a fusion of pathos and scandal in Russia particularly, ballet tapped into the public's interest in Wilde without the problems of verbal translation. Wilde himself, of course, had been looking for new modes of expression in his final years. With the fresh loss of Douglas in September 1897, he decided to write a libretto for Daphnis and Chloe, which, as many of you will know, is a second century Greek story about two soulmates who are separated. And he was going to do it with music by Dalhousie Young. It was not to be, of course, but when Daphnis and Chloe was produced in 1912 with music by Maurice Ravel and no words, it was performed in Paris by the Ballet Russe, with designs by Leon Bakst and choreography by Mikhail Fokine, and Nijinsky as its star. He had danced for the that's not a picture of it, but it's a picture from the same year that I'm fond of. And Nijinsky danced in the same year in L'après-midi d'un faune as the faun, and he danced on point like a ballerina, a sort of gender-bending performance that was very, very racy at the time. Fokine and Diaghilev staged their Salome in Paris in the following year, 1913, with Tamara Karsavina in the lead role. It featured choreography by Boris Romanov, and at the time, critics felt it to be far less successful than their other recent works. So why did they do it? This costume is magnificent. The photograph doesn't quite capture it, actually, but there's Karsavina, and it's also the background, as you can see. So why did they do it? Why bother to stage Wilde? They had a lot else going on. Well, at the time, Wilde's Salome dance was widely considered to be the epitome of erotic transgression in Russia and in Paris, where they performed. Moreover, Salome was already modern, a signal of modern consciousness coming into being and a declaration of intent. In Strauss's opera, as in Strauss's opera, the Ballet Russe was realizing Salome's demand for new forms. In ballet, the body was becoming a new instrument, an instrument that spiritualized Wilde's language into movement where words ran out. The play evolved through the Ballet Russe's vision of reality as perverse performance. In essence, it was an expansion of the expressionism of 1890s ballet, the kind of thing that I spoke about earlier on. But the formal steps of classical ballet are gone in those Ballet Russe productions, and dancing with the lower body only was no longer the thing. This was pioneering choreography that incorporated the whole body with naturalistic movements and really outrageous costumes. No tutus here. And it did so with the imperative of sincere expression. That's really important, and I think that's one of the reasons why they turned to Wilde as well. In the history of dance in literature, criticism has tended to focus on women dancing. I think that's sort of a cause and effect of the Salome factor in the early 20th century, anyway. But Wilde's dancers are men and women, actually. And in The Birthday of the Infanta, this is a male who is also a dwarf. The scenes of the Infanta's day. Oh, let's start. Oh, I don't have I have a picture further on. Let me turn to that. Oh, no, I'll get to that. I'll get to that in a moment. There we go. Okay. So the birthday of the Infanta is, as you know, the story of a dancing dwarf. On the Infanta's day, we see the sprinkles, the possibilities, almost the inevitability, ultimately, of dancing. Right from the beginning, the children are said to glide, the boys process and prance. Then there is a minuet to entertain the Infanta and a troupe from Egypt who sway their bodies in time with their zithers. As we know, though, it's not any of these, but the dwarf who captures the imagination of the Infanta. And this is what she says. There we go. But the funniest part of the whole morning's entertainment was undoubtedly the dancing of the little dwarf. When he stumbled into the arena, waddling on his crooked legs and wagging his huge misshapen head from side to side, the children went off into a loud shout of delight. When the dwarf has danced, the Infanta is so delighted by his spectacle of unself-conscious pleasure that she asks or commands him to dance for her again. He's humbled, he's besotted, and he goes to search for her in order to do his dance. He finds not her, but a mirror, and his search seamlessly transitions into a mirror dance. It was a monster, the most grotesque monster he ever beheld, not properly shaped as all other people were, but hunchbacked and crooked-limbed, with huge lolling head and a mane of black hair. He went towards it, and it came to meet him, copying each step he made and stopping when he stopped himself. He shouted with amusement and ran forward and reached out his hand, and the hand of the monster touched his, and it was as cold as ice. He grew afraid and moved his hand across, and the monster's hand followed it quickly. He tried to press on, but something smooth and hard stopped him. He drew back, and it retreated. And it goes on in similar vein for some time, as you know. Perhaps someone will know whether Wilde ever saw a mirror dance himself on stage. It seems likely. The first high-profile mirror dances had been performed in the 1850s, choreographed by Auguste Bournonville, when it was a formal and technical endeavour to dance with someone on stage. But by the late 19th century, versions were performed as music hall entertainments. This is not one of those, but this is Gene Kelly, and I wanted to show you a mirror dance, and I thought of his alter ego dance in CoverGirl. This, I think, but I could never prove it, also has its origins in Wilde, because when Gene Kelly was working on this film set, he went to visit his friend Edward G. Robinson, who was at the time filming a section of a review film called Flesh and Fantasy, and he was performing it. It was an adaptation of Lord Arthur Savile's Crime. So, and he in Lord Arthur's in the Lord Arthur section, they use this sort of mirroring. He's talking to himself all the time on screen. So I wonder whether that gave Gene Kelly the idea. Wilde's mirror dance here, though, in this bit, Wilde's mirror dance rewrites ballet's pas de deux into comic pathos. The dwarf's dance, like Salome's, takes up the momentum of earlier narrative steps that mean the story was always apt to break into dance right from its very beginning. While the dwarf's first dance for the Infanta had been a joke at his expense, the second one is an act of expression. It's a very personal endeavour. Thinking that his dance partner is an apparition, not his own reflection, he asks, could these shadow things have colour and life and movement? He is a subversion in some ways of Dorian Gray, who first appeared in his expanded edition in the same year, 1891. So he's an illustration of how Wilde's choreographic imagination conceives the double in images. When the Infanta appears and mocks him, the dwarf collapses to the ground, broken-hearted. Wilde's dancers are often close to ecstasy, heartbreak, and death all at once. When they dance, they're both more themselves, more visceral, vulnerable versions of themselves, that is, and also not themselves ever again, really. They're forever changed by the dance. It's one of the frustrations, I think, of dance in this period that very little trace remains. It has a beautiful ephemerality. Even the choreographic notes are often destroyed as the ephemera people thought them to be. But we do know that when the Infanta was adapted, it was very influential. The first person to adapt it that we know of was this chap, Franz Schreker, in Vienna. And it was a landmark work. Schreker created the Infanta as a one-act ballet dance pantomime for chamber orchestra. It had a voiceover, and he returned to it at least 3 times to work on the music and to work on the libretto between 1908 and 1923. We don't tend to remember Schreker, but he was the conductor of the Vienna Philharmonic, and he conducted premieres by Schoenberg and Zemlinsky, who also had a Wilde moment. Zemlinsky did a musical adaptation of the Infanta as the dwarf, Das Zwerg. These works were part of Vienna's avant-garde scene, and they influenced various people, including Alban Berg, which I don't have time to go into. And it's probably one of those productions, or some of those productions, that Robbie Ross is thinking about when he writes to Martin Holman in 1915. And he writes, sorry, you can't see that at all. I'm so sorry. I will read it, and it's quite short. He writes, "It has always occurred to me that many of Wilde's stories would make much better kinema films than actual plays. I refer particularly to The Young King and The Birthday of the Infanta, which, as you know, has been made into ballets in Russia and I think Germany. Of course, different terms would have to be arranged if this could be carried out, and I presume some kinds of words, however foolish, would have to be composed for the actors who play in front of the camera. At all events, there would be required a good deal of construction for arranging the different scenes. I would like to assert Wilde's prior claim to the whole idea." As we know, Ross sought to assert a particular vision of Wilde, but his letters to Holman also show him to be a very astute reader of Anglo-European markets. Here he's negotiating between public appetites and market forces to work out how best to shape Wilde's image. It was not, the Infanta, as far as I know, made into a film. However, the musicality of the Infanta continued to make it popular for musical adaptation. There was another adaptation by John Alden Carpenter in 1919 in the US, and it was staged by former members of the Ballet Russe. My point here is that Wilde's movements are always willing themselves into the modern. They always seem to make the avant-garde a necessity, as really the only way to come to terms with the emotional sincerities and form at the heart of Wilde's thinking. For this reason, this is one of the reasons why the Infanta and Salome, I think, continue through the first couple of decades of the 20th century to exert a pull on the imagination, though we forget about the Infanta, which I think is another sort of interesting thing about critical trend. Once again, we see dancing, and finally see dancing in the Ballad of Reading Gaol. The Ballad of Reading Gaol is writing itself toward dance from its very beginning. The prisoners tramp and shuffle, then their walking becomes quickened, and it shifts into, and I'm quoting all the time here, a light and gay step. one that's set in contrast with the souls in pain who tramped the other ring. And the stanzas, of course, that march fatalistically toward the condemned man's inevitable fate also provide a contrast with that quickened step, the light step. When the poem does break into dance, this time, though, it's purely theoretical. Here it is. It is sweet to dance to violins when love and life are fair. To dance to flutes, to dance to lutes is delicate and rare, he says. Before the dancing, then, of course, is turned into a grotesque euphemism that turns again on the analogies between dancing and death. Quote, "But it is not sweet with nimble feet to dance upon the air." Even corrupted into this grim metaphor, dancing is a counterpoint to hard labour, and these light rhythms in this verse contrast to the rhythms of the harder rhythms, the hard stops of the rhythms in the stanzas before and afterwards. When dancing returns later in the poem, it is darker yet. It's mocking and chilling too. This comes at night as the condemned man waits execution, and crooked shapes of terror appear, crouching first, and then dancing. And I've not quoted in full, but we have the following lines: "They glided past, they glided fast. They mocked the moon in a rigadoon. They trod a saraband with the pirouettes of marionettes." And of course, you'll also hear echoes of the harlot's house in the marionettes there. How typical that Wilde's terrors would do formal dances. The saraband and the rigadoon are exotic, but they're rules-based dances, making them quite different from the expressive solo dances that he favours in Salome and even, arguably, in The Dwarf. This is a different kind of choreographic imagination, one that changes the frame of reference from personal expression to rule-based form, against which the individual is powerless and oppressed. Wilde is often dreaming of extricating himself from words, in conclusion. He joins Pater in the fantasy that we'll hardly have time to make theories about the things we see and touch. For Pater, all arts aspire to the condition of music. For Ronald Furbank, mentioned yesterday by Kristen, novels aspire to the condition of musical comedy. But for Wilde, and Pater never far from my mind, but for Wilde, plays and short stories, I think, aspire to the ballet. In the last, the three most recent adaptations of Wilde in the West End in London, dancing has provided a way to liberate Wilde from the 19th century too. Here, I'll talk through them. Dance has lifted in these productions of, on the left, An Ideal Husband, top right, the importance of being earnest at the National Theatre, bottom right, picture of Dorian Gray at the Haymarket a couple of years ago. In these productions, dancing has lifted audiences out of the now familiar turns of Wilde's plots and witticisms into a realm of high camp and exuberant visceral pleasure. Dorian breaks into I Feel Love, discoing at the moment, the moment where, after they've read the Yellow Book, in An Ideal Husband, there is dancing between each of the scenes to R&B and rap music, and the National Theatre's Ernest begins with this scene of Algernon playing the piano and then going into a sort of expressionist ballet with other members of the cast before the play, as we know it, begins. When musical interpreters take up the dancing Wilde, they show us something about Wilde too. And rereading him through his early artistic interpreters, I think, offers to rebalance our understanding of Wilde's contexts and his value. Moves us from symbolist, it moves him and his works from symbolist to expressionist, from wit to serious writer. And it asks us again to think about his aspirations as a writer, as a literary stylist and thinker, with those words winged with light. So what kind of dancer would he be? Well, I think when it came to ballet, he'd probably be in the stalls with Arthur Symonds, actually. And I'd like to think, and I'm thinking at the moment of my children are watching this live streamed, and I'd like to think that he would join us in an impromptu dance of Love Cats. But I think his own dancing was probably more somber than that. It registers the potential for freedom and self-expression. It longs for bodies winged with light. But when the music begins, I think he's dancing on his own. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Kate. I appreciated the reference to Robin's famous song at the end, dancing by oneself or by oneself or on my own. It's intriguing just to think. I'm editing An Ideal Husband at the moment, and it is intriguing thinking about that recent production with the bursts of R&B, because there's a massive R&B revival going on in Britain, and I'm not quite sure what to make of that. But one thing I would like to comment on is Wilde's physical presence. And one of the nastiest sets of observations about Wilde's body is made by Michael Field. I mean, they were absolutely unsparing in their journals about how magnificently and ridiculously kind of physically grotesque he had become in the early 1890s. And his corpulence, he was trying to be as dandified as possible, and he was elephantine. And really, as far as they were concerned, in all their kind of aesthetic snobbery, but they were also trying to sort of think about it quite carefully. Their encounter with him at Tite Street, they were welcomed into the home. He was elephantine, right? There was nothing graceful or balletic about this man at all. And obviously it's that massive incongruity with the aesthetics of the body that you have been focusing on in aspects of his work. And I do find that rather interesting. How, would he waltz? Would he pirouette? What would he do? And we think about Max Beerbohm, who's doing equally unpleasant satires on his corpulence with the tiny little feet.
Yes, exactly, yeah, which draws attention to his largeness and those.
Yes, I'm just wondering how we think about these things, the incongruities, and
with Pater as well. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yes, well, the ugliness.
Appearance was sort of too tall, too big.
Yes.
For himself.
Yeah, and the horrible moustache that everybody hated. Yeah. And thank you very much. I mean, I thought it was absolutely extraordinary kind of investigation. Are there thoughts that we'd like to share on this? Kristen.
I wanted to ask you about how you think the sort of tradition of decadent illustration inflected some of the ways of thinking about dance and adaptation of Wilde. I'm just thinking about the conversation we had about the image of the kiss and the way that they seem to be kind of floating in space. And I think like the Alistair image that you showed, like I always find when I'm looking at like Beardsley or Alistair kind of like taking up Beardsley that there's this, I feel unmoored when I'm trying to understand like what is foreground, what is background, and like how people are situated in space in those images. And I could see something about like what you were talking about with the kind of individualism of certain modes of dance, that there might be something kind of liberating about being kind of extricated from space or not situated in space. But I do think like if we're thinking about these images somehow registering in the way that Wildean dance gets practiced in some of these adaptations, that there's something dizzying about the way that both Beardsley and Alistair, like all of these kinds of decadent illustrators, tend to represent space that would make it difficult for that to filter into dance.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. As you say, we mentioned yesterday about how Beardsley is, Beardsley's illustrations, but particularly that illustration of the kiss and how Wilde conceived of Beardsley as knowing where the dance is, and how interesting that. What does it mean? Unless there is a sort of and the still point of the turning world later on. Think about it's Eliot. They're the dancers. Dancing becomes a sort of this metaphor that then carries through into the modernist period. I think you're right about illustration, and I think that I'm not sure, I haven't looked at it specifically, but I think that with that Alistair image as well, you see a ballet dancing dwarf. The dwarf is dancing, he has his feet are dancer's feet, so he's ready to take motion, which is sort of, but never can, of course, static. Yes, I'm sure there are lots of other examples, actually, which I don't know. Thank you.
Thank you. Yvonne.
That was just lovely. Thinking about the Schreker, the Schreker adaptation of The Birthday of the Infanta. So he's working with the Wiesenthal sisters. I mean, I think this fits even better into what you're writing about here. The Wiesenthal sisters have been at the court ballet as young ladies, and then they quit it, wanting to be able to do, Isadora Duncan type dancing, and I haven't been able to pin it down, but I think it's they who commission Schreker, like they, I believe, so that they,
have the idea of the Infanta.
But precisely because of the description of the dances in the Infanta, because they're attracted to, the idea of a wild dance or a dance based in nature. So yeah.
Yeah, and Schreker, he writes about I don't have time for the space, but he writes about the dance as well.
Yeah.
And about his vision. Not his vision. It's a bit. It's not very insightful, but he writes about the dance and how important it is.
Yeah, and he also, I think one of the sisters says, or maybe he says in his memoir somewhere, that he wrote it really quickly. He was so inspired by this that he wrote the music super fast, and he would go and visit them, and he would, show them the music, and they would kind of, riff off each other, and so it's a really exciting thing.
Good. I didn't know about the origin of how he came.
Yeah, and I'll try and send you. But what I wanted to ask you was, so in The Birthday of the Infanta, Wilde describes the dance, and whether the narrated dance, because it seems to me it's the narration of the dance, or it's the description that it's the dance of the wind, or the dance of the, what is it, the dance of the grass, and the dance of the corn, and so on. Whether this is one of the places where he's describing dance in a way that he doesn't describe it elsewhere. It's wild and not like W-I-L-D, and not formal. Or whether you've been thinking about the language he uses to narrate dance, I suppose, in The Birthday.
I think it shifts. Of course, I couldn't see any trends to draw out. So I haven't. I think that there's a development, and well, maybe development's the wrong word. I think he narrates dance in different ways depending on his purposes, rather than there being a sort of a thing that one could say that this is how he does it. So, but I think that I think that it fits into the idea that this is a different kind of Wilde, a delicate Wilde. I think his descriptions they're not witty, they're delicate, they're aestheticist, actually, I think. So, but I don't think there's in that instance. But I don't think I could then expand and say, And this also applies to the ballad, or this is the case in Salaric, as obviously isn't. So, yeah.
I think we have reached the point, I'm afraid, colleagues, where I have to say, Kate, that was simply wonderful. It has drawn our conference to a magnificent conclusion. It has shed unique light, as have all of the papers, on Wilde's legacies and his modernist legacies. So let us thank you most warmly. Thank you very much. As you know, this has all been live streamed. It is recorded now. It's going to be uploaded to the Centre and Clark's YouTube platform. It will remain there for about 3 months. It then eventually gets taken down. So all of us can go back to relish many wonderful key moments in the conference. Our coach is waiting to take the speakers to the next venue. So I'm afraid we're going to